Dobrý podvečer, vítam vás v Galerii Medium a na ďalšej prednáške zo série Nové rozhrania, kde by som chcela privítať nášho hostia, nemeckého kurátora Klausa Speidela, ktorý mal vlastne už minulý rok u nás prednášku. Ja som sa ho rozhodla znova pozvať. Tento rok máme také iné tematické zameranie, ktoré sa venuje rôznym priestorom. Tentokrát Klaus si vybral pre storytellingu, nejakých narratívov, ktoré sú umelci vytvárajú, je to tiež podľa mňa aj s tým druhom priestoru. Aj v rámci teda výstavy Katky Poliačikovej, ktorá sa tiež venuje týmto témam. Ja by som predala už slovo Klausovi a teda ešte by som chcela poďakovať Fondu na podporu umenia, s ktorého podporou vlastne realizujeme celú túto sériu. Klaus, welcome. I briefly introduced you and that you have already had a lecture last year. And that this one will be focused more on storytelling and narratives. That's the topic that you are really devoted to. I think besides AI, which is also one topic that you certainly can talk for hours, but now I will give you a word and I'm looking forward to what you will tell us and show us in pictures. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining me, not around the campfire, but around the screen, even though the weather is so warm and nice. Happy to be here with you. I decided, reading about the exhibition, who's the artist? You are the artist, yes. Reading about your exhibition, I thought it would be interesting to talk about the subject of storytelling, and it has been a subject that, as Miroslava said, occupied me for many, many years. I did my PhD in Paris in the Sorbonne on visual narrative and started working on the topic in 2006. And I'm trying to get away from it, but sometimes, you can't avoid it. And today's one of these occasions. And fortunately, sometimes there are new inputs that come out, and this is a book that came out this year by an author that you might know, Byung-Chul Han. He's the most translated German philosopher now, German-Korean philosopher. And he wrote a book that's called The Crisis of Narration, or The Crisis of Narrative. And I took that as an inspiration, but speak of the crises in the plural. That's why I think there's several crises. And I wanted to start, however, with two questions. To you, when you hear the word story, what are the thoughts or images that come up in your mind spontaneously? No, it's not spontaneous anymore, so you have to start talking.
Something that has some structure that we follow. Okay. And that's not a picture or something that I can follow and that has certain climax then. And the narrator is important.
Okay, that's already a very well theoretically informed association. Was that your first association?
Just a fairy tale.
Fairy tale, okay, good.
For me it's connection.
Connection, interesting.
And conveying a message story carries a message.
Yeah, okay.
Vessel for message.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to write a few things because it's very nice and I'll forget them. Yeah.
Especially here in this exhibition, this interface between story and myth.
Yeah.
There are many simple or seemingly simple stories.
Yeah.
And then something more general arises from this quite a mysterious process.
Mm-hmm. Story and myth. What was your first idea? No?
Is something connected to human life or humans, especially like story which somebody lived through or something, something interesting in their life.
Okay, yeah.
Something chronological that have started and.
Okay, and maybe you also want to tell us.
There should be a point of curiosity
Of
Curiosity.
curiosity. Ah, okay. That it's curious what is being said, or.
Even if it's boring, then I'm curious why it's so boring.
Interesting. And when you hear storytelling, what is the image that comes to your mind? Storytelling.
Voice,
Voice.
coffee, fire,
Nice.
wine.
The broad space between intimacy and public manipulation.
Oh, also very informed definition. Do you have associations as well?
Yeah, storytelling maybe is more structured, like Nika said, that it's also it's something which begins and ends. So
Yeah.
telling has to have some flow or something.
And what's your association?
Art of telling stories.
Art of telling. Ah, okay, nice. Yeah, I was wondering also about, of course, my associations, and I'm somehow pleasantly surprised that no one had this association when I said story, because in a certain sense, of course, as you see, these are the stories that we share on social media, and somehow, yeah, storytelling, that's me, my story today, and these are the stories that my contacts shared today. So storytelling has somehow, or stories, yeah, a lot of people, I think young people would think of their Instagram stories when they hear story nowadays. And some of them are real stories, I would say. Here, agricultural worker who's an artist, and he really tells stories in these stories. And I went back because I was like, what? You can see my browsing behavior as well as I perceive these. And where he films his grandparents stealing a plant from the mall. But of course, most people share things which we wouldn't normally call a story, that don't have a beginning and an end, that don't have a structure, that are not connected to myth, far from it, that can hardly be followed, apart from the sense of following someone on social media. Most of these things are not stories in that sense. And we'll come to that again with Byung-Chul Han, because he thinks that this is part of our problem today with storytelling, when he thinks that we have lost the ability to tell stories. And I think it's important to have this browsing behavior at the same time, which was quite natural. I mean, I did a screen capture, but I think that's the way I more or less browse these stories, because the relationship to these tools is so automatic that even if I had tried to perform my consumption of these stories, I would have had a hard time, because we have these automatisms that quickly kick in when we open our tools, and they use us maybe more than we use them. But of course, the more traditional association, and the one which is maybe the counter image to that, is sitting around the campfire with storytelling. Here an image from Richard Brooke, and or also this very nice drawing from Will Eisner, himself a storyteller, where he illustrated the story of The Old Mariner by Sam Coleridge, and I have taken it with me to read it to you, because it is very insightful in terms of what it tells us about how storytelling can work on us. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, text of 1834, by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Part 1. It is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of three. By thy long grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stoppeth thou me? The bridegroom's doors are opened wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set. Mayst hear the merry din. He holds him with his skinny hand. There was a ship, quoth he. Hold off, unhand me, grey bird loon. Eftsoons his hand dropped he. He holds him with his glittering eye. The wedding guest stood still and listens like a 3 years child. The mariner hath his will. The wedding guest sat on a stone. He cannot choose but hear, when thus spake out the ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. So, it is of course the story of this wedding guest, well dressed and going to be important guest in this wedding, and the mariner stops him to tell a story. And as soon as the story starts with, once upon a time, you had the association of fairy tale with this formulaic words, he can't help himself and stops and listens and becomes like a child. And of course, this is a powerful effect of storytelling, which can be traced to hormones. We see that there is oxytocin in our blood, so you spoke about connection as well. Oxytocin also happens to be the hormone that we have when we connect with our children for the first time, when a child is born, or when we hold a child, when we hold loved ones, we have oxytocin. So when people listen together to a story, they have high levels of oxytocin, also of cortisol, which increases the focus, and of dopamine, which is a pleasure hormone that a lot of you will know. So this leads to a certain precision in storytelling, and also maybe an emotional involvement. When someone tells us a story, we take down our guard. We're like, okay, she's not trying to convince me. Let's listen to the story. And stories can also be used to illustrate abstract facts. I can tell you a concept, can give you a concept, and then the story will anchor the concept in reality, in lived reality as well, very often. So story is a very powerful human, and I don't even know if I want to call it tool at that point, but let's call it a cultural technique, also maybe a technical term, a human ability maybe even, to go a bit more primitive. But certainly also a tool, and it has been discovered as a tool by, of course, marketing. And I wanted to show you that as well. There's at least one cognitive theorist, Jérôme Brunner, who thinks that the narrative is a mode of cognitive functioning. There are two modes of thought, each providing distinctive ways of ordering experience, of constructing reality. A good story and a well-formed argument. They are, according to Brunner, different natural kinds. Both can be used as a means for convincing, yet what they convince of is fundamentally different. Arguments convince one of their truth, stories of their lifelikeness, truthfulness maybe. The one verifies by eventual appeal to procedures for establishing formal and empirical proof. The other establishes not truth, but verisimilitude. It has been claimed that one is a refinement of or an abstraction from the other, but this must be either false or true only in the most unenlightening way. So in this actual minds, possible worlds, Brunner really develops the idea that, stories are one way to structure experience, theories, arguments are another. But of course you can support theories with stories and vice versa. And so I was talking about this power that stories hold over us, that's illustrated in this image very well. And this power has been discovered relatively recently, in the 90s, in the 2000s, and now there is a storytelling boom, and you can see TED Talk storytelling, personal storytelling, and there's Leader's Guide, because leaders are supposed to be storytellers, and you see the campfire that has become a kind of pictogram. It's the pictogram campfire. It's just the remainder, the kind of shell of the original storytelling that's still there. Visual story engine, for financial advisors, lawyers, all these people now are supposed to learn how to tell stories, to convince and potentially make more money. Storytelling is, as we will see, story selling. And this omnipresence of stories could make you wonder, is there really a crisis of storytelling. If everybody is constantly telling stories and if people do so systematically, does that mean that there's a crisis? There's at least one man who has been thinking that there's a crisis of storytelling quite some time, over 100 years now, about 100 years. That's Walter Benjamin in his text, The Narrator, where he says that the culprit, what is to blame, is information. So we have the press, and the press aims to bring information. As the founder of the Figaro said, a house burning in the Quartier Latin of Paris is more important than a revolution elsewhere for my readers. So information for Walter Benjamin makes us unable of listening to stories anymore, and makes us unable to know our whereabouts. Because information always comes with explanation. At least that's Benjamin's thesis. And a good story, according to him, doesn't give the explanation. It remains open in terms of its meaning. It maybe has an element of marvelous or strange in it. So according to Walter Benjamin, we have lost our way in the world because der Erzähler ist jemand, der den Menschen Rat weiß. The narrator is someone who knows to give advice to people. And as we have lost the ability to narrate, according to him, we have somehow lost our way to find advice. And Benjamin goes on by saying, der Erzähler weiß, wie eine sich eben abspielende Geschichte weitergeht. So the way he knows advice is by knowing how a story that's currently unfolding might continue. So there's this idea that there's a relationship between living stories, stories unfolding, and stories as we tell them. And you can learn from the stories as we tell them how a story might unfold that you're living through somehow. Well, that is the first, I would say, moment where someone says loud and clear, storytelling is in crisis. We could go back to perhaps even Plato and Aristotle, but I will not do that now. Let's stay in modernity for the moment. So that's the first big moment. The second big moment, I would say, can be linked to, this quote when you Google Adorno Auschwitz that you quickly find, where Adorno says, poetry is barbaric after Auschwitz, and later he somehow revises that judgment, and a lot of people are very quick to say, well, Paul Celan wrote Die Todesfuge, and therefore it is proved wrong that poetry is impossible, and poetry is not narrative. But in Adorno's theory, this is really about art and the possibility of narrating after something so terrible happened and something that's unspeakable happened. And of course, it's a big question of how you can narrate such events, but also how you can keep telling stories after such events. How can you keep making Hollywood movies? How can you keep writing fun stories and so on after the Holocaust? So I would say that's a second crisis of storytelling, or a second reason why I would say storytelling is in crisis. Karl Kraus, a very important Austrian voice, suddenly fell silent when Hitler took power and said, zu Adolf Hitler fällt mir nichts ein. I can't speak, I can't say anything about Adolf Hitler, and a lot of people blamed Karl Kraus for that because he had attacked everyone for a long time, and he didn't speak about Hitler. And some people have said it's because when the world becomes satire, you can't make satire anymore. But so there is this problem of a certain event in the world and the ability to still narrate in face of these events in the 20th century. And now we're much closer to, and I do a very quick parcours of these different crises. A third moment of crisis is exactly associated to this by Christian Salmon, because Christian Salmon says stories were in a way to the people, and now they have been confiscated by, as he says, the empire. And he also comes from the thinking of Antonio Negri and the Empire book. So stories have been confiscated by the empire. They're used by politicians to sell their politics. They're used by companies to sell their products. Every company has a founder's story, of course, to tell. They also have philosophies, they have a worldview, and companies constantly tell stories to, well, as Christian Salmon says, here we can see it a little bit, to formater les esprits, bewitch the mind, formater les esprits, to format the spirit, the minds. And he thinks that storytelling leads us away from rational beings to emotional beings. So everything that could be good as well when we harness it for community building, for exchange in an interpersonal way, becomes a very powerful tool to manipulate us. So that's the idea here. So storytelling has been confiscated. And one book that is not usually read as part of the criticism of storytelling, but storytelling plays a very important role in it, is by Luc Boltanski and Arnaud Esquerret. And it's called Enrichment, a critique of the commodity. And now it's been translated, but this is 2017. And they say there are different forms of products. There's the standard form, which is vital to industrial economies. Let's say a glass like this, which you make money with because you produce it and ship it for cheaper than you sell it. That's the standard form, that's Marx, that's the surplus value. Then there's the collection form, and that's the form that's based on a narrative attached to an object's past. If now I went about talking about how this glass has a history and how when the first time a certain writer came to this school, it was exactly this glass that he drank from or she drank from, and she showed it and she made a point about ontology and transformation of art, and suddenly this glass becomes charged, it becomes enriched. It's not losing its price like the ordinary merchandise, which starts losing its value as soon as it comes out of the factory. It does the opposite, it suddenly starts increasing the value again. And that's what they call the collection form. You have this with cars, you have it with Jane Birkin bags from luxury brands. You also have it, according to them, with places. Arles, for them, is a bassin d'enrichissement, an enrichment basin where people invest. It's deindustrialized, it has nothing, but people started investing, including Maya Hoffman from the Roche Pharmaceuticals, build a big foundation and so on. And suddenly Arles becomes a place to be and is enriched in that way. Then there's the trend form, which is crucial to fashion economies and linked to present-day celebrities, and the asset form, which is more with financial economies. So the collection form is linked to this idea of the enrichment economy, and the specificity, they say, lies in profits derived from a commerce of objects that, even when they are manufactured industrial, give rise to valorization based primarily on the three other forms. It is associated with particular ways of exploiting a highly qualified local workforce entrusted with the task of such valorization. In this sense, the profits it generates depend in part on the extraction of surplus value labor. Who is this surplus value labor? The people who can tell you about a Jeff Koons sculpture, because art, of course, is often also part of the enrichment economy. Artworks are part of the enrichment economy. They're often enriched with the stories that are told about them. A certain pissoir that has been signed, Ries that was lost and that has been replicated, is valuable because of the story it is associated with. How Marcel Duchamp decided to turn it into an artwork, send it to an exhibition. It was first rejected, even though they said they would exhibit everything for people who paid the fee. And then he wrote an article where he said, look at this pissoir, I say this is art, and the New York avant-garde didn't recognize it. And of course it becomes the first so-called ready-made ordinary object turned into an artwork by an artistic intention. This also depends on the story that's being told about it. And a lot of objects, even if you even think of drawings by certain authors and so on, it's hard to justify the monetary value if it's not for this enrichment that is generated by the narrative. And there are two narratives in Duchamp. It's a double narrative. There's the narrative of the history of art, in which certain works take the place of stations of the cross of modern art, as W.J.T. Mitchell said, Malevich's Black Square is one station of the cross in the story of modern art. Duchamp's Fountain is another. The Erase de Kooning drawing by Rauschenberg, where he asked de Kooning for drawing to erase it and then declared the erased artwork his own artwork, is another of these moments in the story of art as we tell it. And then there are also the shorter stories, like the story of how Duchamp sent this artwork to this exhibition and so on. We take Arnaud Esquerret and Boltanski seriously. There is another crisis of storytelling, because storytelling is also used to make the rich richer, the rich richer, right? Because they basically have the power to buy these enriched goods, to preserve them, to pay the highly qualified labor force that will write texts for the Sotheby website, for the Christie's website, that will exhibit it in galleries with fancy clothes on and so on and so forth. And all that contributes to, enriching these goods and then making them assets. That's why there's a connection to the other forms, of course. Making them assets that you can collect and then hopefully resell to a greater fool, as one economic theory that's called the greater fool theory says. You're making a profit as long as you find a greater fool. That is the idea of that theory. Okay, so that's the very short parcours of these first moments of crisis of narrative that I find interesting and relevant. And now we arrive here in Bratislava today with Byung-Chul Han and his ideas on the crisis of narrative. He's very strongly inspired by Benjamin, and he really goes directly back to Benjamin and says what Benjamin detected has only become worse, has only become stronger recently. And one of his key terms is informatization, where he says that information suppresses occurrences that cannot be explained, but only narrated. Stories are often bordered by the miraculous and the enigmatic. They do not tolerate information as opposing the enigma. Explanation and narrative are mutually exclusive, he says. And he creates a series of concepts, big concepts that are in opposition to each other. The stories that we now consume in this time of informatization and datafication are micro-narratives, the micro-stories of the present, right? They're these, and I'll play that again in the background, the micro-narratives that are replaceable, that are very constructed. We have understood the stories, we kind of now know how they work, we know which hormones are present when stories are told, we know how to create stories that people will engage with. We have a narrative consciousness. They're replaceable, whereas the old stories, but I have a few more concepts, sorry. There's a lack of distance with these stories as well. The world in which these stories live don't have an aura anymore. This is, of course, Benjamin, for whom the aura was very important. They are near to us. We have a lack of distance to them. They're linked to consumption, and you see at one moment here, I suddenly get an advertisement and I have to click myself through the advertisement because, of course, what we do when we fill this with our stories is creating minds that are available for advertisers to sell us something and to make sure that we have attention time. This is the advertisement, you see? That's not a friend of mine. This was an ad which was also one of the stories in the middle. So it's stories for consumers. It's linked to story selling. It's the stories on social platforms such as this. And they give us the feeling of something contingent, something that could be different also. There are these stories that I clicked on. I could have clicked on if I had come 5 minutes later. There would have been different stories. And I could go on clicking on all these contingent stories and would have a certain feeling of consuming, of being in the now. Constantly being in the now is, of course, also something that's linked to these stories. They tell you Instagram in of their slogans says, share a story, share what you're doing, and 24 hours later it disappears. The promise of this disappearance, but which is also a pressure of the disappearing, because you then need to feed the machine if you want to stay present, if you want to be on people's minds, if you want your friends to care, and so on and so forth. And of course, we also have the illusion that our friends will see these stories, because the fact that I post something does not mean that someone sees it. And I don't know if you are on some platforms, but it happens frequently that you're like, so yeah, since I've been living there, since I've been living in London, and then the person's like, you're living in London? And you're like, yeah, didn't you see? I shared it on Facebook. And then you realize that, there's an asymmetry between I share and you receive, right? It's not because I shared that you will receive, right? So there's no security of the sharing of a story in these contexts. You have the feeling that, yeah, I put it out there and now everybody knows, my contacts know, but no, the algorithm will filter. And if the story of you moving to London, the algorithm thinks that they can sell Nike shoes better if they don't tell this other person, they will not tell this other person that you moved to London, right? So there's this asymmetry, of course. So this is the side of this new story sharing and story in a kind of new way. It's a kind of newspeak. Of course, all these tools constantly take the terms we have, that we've used for centuries, for millennia, like story, like friend, like, whatever these terms are, and then they give them new meanings. And usually the meanings are a bit more shallow, a bit more small. The message, what message? You spoke about the message in the stories, and it's not just, hey, I'm going out tonight. That's not the message you were thinking of. That's not the message we think of when someone runs from marathon or runs to marathon, and to bring a message of a victory. These are the messages that the old stories were supposed to convey, not like these small messages. So all the wording, of course, has been taken over, and I'm afraid, we still say Facebook friend, maybe, because we are this generation, but I'm not sure that, a 20-year-old says Facebook friend. And that people from younger generations can easily say, I met someone. Where did you meet them? On TikTok. So meeting someone doesn't mean meeting like we do here physically, but so the words change their meaning, and this is a very important part of that development. Well, and so these stories also isolate people, because I sit here and I see what some of my friends share, but I have no contact with them actually. Maybe the contact will be a fake contact. I will give them a thumbs up or heart or whatever the platform is, and it's like, I've been in contact with this person, but it's as fast forgotten, and of course they will have a list of 50 people who put a thumbs up. It's a very different kind of contact, and of being in contact and giving feedback, than when we're both here in a room. So it kind of isolates people more. And now, talking about AI, people will also be able to always have someone to send messages to and get replies from. Because, I've seen on Skype now they implemented the Bing chatbot. So you can now talk on Skype, instead of talking to one of your contacts, you can just talk to the Bing chatbot. And it's much more emotional than the usual ChatGPT, if you're aware. And and so I started having this conversation. And at one point, when a lot of your conversations happen here, maybe it doesn't matter that much anymore whether the person who's responding you is actually a person or a machine. Because what you get is just a line of words, and your friends sleep and the machine never sleeps. And so there's, of course, a certain risk also linked to that. So it's a feeling of isolation, whereas the old narrative created community. And as you can tell, I'm developing the thoughts of Byung-Chul Han as we go. So the old stories were not told through screens, but around the campfire. They didn't have the arbitrariness, but they had the feeling of necessity. Not the contingency, but the necessity. They were about an account, he says, Kunde, not about information, about an account of something that happened, not just information. They negotiated closeness and distance rather than having this lack of distance that we have here. They were linked to traces, to secrets, enigmas, Rätsel, Wundersames. They were verbindlich und verbindend. They were, verbindlich means the opposite of non-engaging. They were linked to an engagement. And verbinden means connecting. So they were verbindlich und verbindend, verankern im Sein. They bounding, thank you, they were exactly much more bounding, absolutely. And they verankern uns im Sein. They connect us to being rather than taking us out of being. They had a narrative Bannkraft. They had a force to absorb us. When I'm listening to a story, I don't swipe next, I'm there for the moment that this story is being told until it's over. They could be world-changing, world-opening, he says, and they also captured the ambience of their time as opposed to these micro-narratives of the present. Well, so these are differences. The current information society, Informationsgesellschaft, leads to a lack of being, he says, in the end. All this information is additive, cumulative. There's no one meaning, and there's always the next news that pops in, and that's not just on these tools, but also, of course, on the media themselves, even the legacy media, that now everybody thinks, oh, the legacy media were so great, right? And now we have this bad social media with fake news, and we love the legacy media, but of course the legacy media were already, in this machine of bringing the news and bringing the next news and the next, and so on and so forth. They don't give a direction, whereas the old narratives gave us a certain form of direction and community. And they're linked a lot to story selling. And when you Google story selling, that comes up. Tell a tale, make a sale. So that's where we, in a way, have arrived. That's the present moment. The story needs to have a point, and they tell you exactly how you make sure that people don't miss out on your brand in the story you tell, and so on. So that's the story selling. And there's some story selling in images. This, I would say, arguably is a narrative image. And it was very interesting to me, and it was a pure coincidence. I was going through different magazines, and I found this one, and then there was that one, and then there was this one. And so apparently the fridge is like the new center of the family. And it's also interesting how these images differ, right? Here it says, il est beau, fiable et intelligent, which is funny because it says he is beautiful, reliable and intelligent. And here the man is absent, right? So the fridge has basically replaced the man of this family. And the image has, of course, this air of very advertisement-like, right? It looks nearly like a studio. Whereas here we have a bit more of an attempt maybe to make it look realistic. You see they're barefoot, they're not well-dressed, they don't look into the camera. So here Alois Riegel would say this is äußere Einheit. Alois Riegel, the art historian. They need us because she's looking at us, right? It's like addressing the viewer. Here they have an inner unity. At least they're focused on each other. And images of inner unity are images of absorption, as well as Michael Fried calls them, are somehow maybe make you feel like they're more authentic. And he has his teddy bear like hanging down, and there's of course this little relationship between them. Each has their level, but both drink orange juice, I suppose. And then there's this one, which is like the full-on, like I play the game of authenticity. Right, the face of the father is kind of, he's making a joke for his baby, and he's wearing these, night shoes, and of course it's the father that gets up and makes the drink for the baby. which I must say, in my case, I just got a baby 2.5 months ago. It's true, even though we don't have a microwave, and let alone one from Miele. But yes, so here you can see this is the language of authenticity. His hair is kind of, mixed up, and the image is kind of a bit messy, right? So different ways of story selling, of course, through images here. And then you have some that is, of course, the famous Never Hide by RayBan, which sometimes, this goes towards the Instagram story, I would say. Yeah? Here we're not on the level of, not at all on the level of depth of these traditional stories, but they also made these ones where they played with historical reference, or even that one, which I find quite interesting because it kind of projects this different past, and or a past of, not hiding, being gay in the 1940s in New York City. And it also shows maybe a little bit how advertisement could also be if, the advertisers fought a bit harder for more interesting ideas to get through. And there's only a few examples of advertisements which use the space that's given to advertisement to do something meaningful, to say something meaningful beyond advertising the brand. Not only advertising the brand, but also, like this, it's like only advertising the brand, it's only about a certain life feeling and so on. It is, nothing, but maybe having a sort of like challenging, probably this is challenging to a few people at least, such an advertisement, is challenging a little bit. And I think, it would be great if there was a kind of change of thinking, but it's a different story. And then there's another thing that happens, and Bui Chun Han doesn't speak about it, but I think they are also very important, is the blockbusters and how they tell stories. And how their stories, so that's when I type blockbuster movies. Google tells me what to watch, recommended for you. And here I'm a bit reassured, because if that's what they recommend to me, they don't know me very well. I've seen Independence Day, but not Return. I saw the original one when it came out, but all these others I unfortunately missed, or fortunately missed. But of course the blockbuster movie and Independence Day is a case in point, kind of contribute to formatting our minds. So I would say actually Independence Day, where America is always victorious, where we always know who the bad guys and who are the good guys, prepared, George W. Bush's worldview with the axis of evil, and prepared the minds for Trump. Because people are constantly fed with stories where it's clear who's bad, who's good, where it's all about showing your power and winning, and they find these stories believable at one point, right? There was a recent speech which I found somewhat surprising by Zelensky in Cannes for the film festival, where he said, first cinema was our life, and then our life became cinema, or something like this, which in a way makes sense with his biography, but also seems to be this bigger message, right? And he has a program that is the War of Drones, and the person who's the spokesperson in the US is the person who played Luke Skywalker. So there's this consciousness, of an intertwinement of Luke Skywalker, of course, being the main character of Star Wars. So, and the empire of evil is like a term that is now used for Russia a lot, and of course this is something that comes from the blockbuster movie, and maybe it's okay in this case, but we need to be conscious of the fact that this is a certain way of using a terminology that actually comes from the movies and now is imported into the real to talk about the real, and that of course puts away all the blurriness and everything that maybe the stories that we heard about here, where we have, the enigmatic, the border of miraculous and so on. All this is, of course, totally gone in stories like Independence Day, or also, I would say, Star Wars, despite its qualities. Good. This is the first part about the crises of storytelling and some aspects. am not sure that information always comes with explanation. I think this is already a kind of, I don't understand the shortcut. I think Benjamin already makes a shortcut when he says, information comes with explanation. There's so much info which is like, this happened. We don't know who did it, we don't know why it happened, but this happened, right? So I think this kind of equivocation or putting this two together doesn't totally make sense. And I would also say that even the old stories are often explanations, even for features of the landscape, right? Like this mountain was created when this giant was angry, right? What is it? It's explaining why our country looks this way, for instance, and so on. So myth is a lot about explaining things. So I agree with you that is something that could be questioned, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, perhaps we only meant this explanation in the scientific way. So after the entanglement of the disenchantment of the world in that epoch, the scientific explanations tends to be against the enigma. Yeah, that would be a possible way to like have a charitable reading and say, yes, it's more about the bigger picture, that we live in a disenchanted world, even though maybe not each piece of news comes with the explanation. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah, please.
Like legacy media, which you use?
Oh yeah, legacy media is the way people who do podcasts and who are on social media and so used to refer to, say, the New York Times, the big kind of media companies, traditional media. They call them legacy media now. Yeah, and of course they also trade in worldviews in a way. I mean, implicitly at least, I would say that. Legacy, as a media, also trade in worldviews. When I had a subscription to the New York Times, a digital subscription, and it made me so angry was the Trump time that every article in the New York Times still presupposed that America is the greatest country in the world, that I unsubscribed, because there was always, even when they were like, we're botching the COVID response, everything's wrong, but America, how can that happen even though America is the greatest country in the world? And there was such a strong worldview, even in the New York Times, which is progressive and so on, that had to kind of always be there within the legacy media. So of course these pieces of information and the way they are presented in the media often depends also on a kind of worldview. And
is he using the term?
No.
Because it's quite an old-fashioned term.
Yeah, no. You mean Byung-Chul Han? No, he doesn't use the term. I mean, but he's not uncomfortable with old-fashioned language, quite the opposite. His way of writing is very much informed by Heidegger or Benjamin and so on. So, yeah, that's also a good point. So there's the connection. I mean, stories can definitely support information and of course, thinking that's also maybe one major problem with Christian Salmon is that even if we think it's a tool, it can be used for supporting Trump or to talk about the climate catastrophe. And so it's not necessarily, I think he's a bit too sweeping in his criticism of narrative.
Or even in the narrative psychotherapy.
Yeah.
You change your basic story, you change your personality.
Yes.
And that's something different from the Heideggerian tradition.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. I mean, there are different ways in which stories matter to us, and identity is definitely an important aspect. Also, personal identities. So, what stories do you tell yourself, and how do you tell yourself the events of your life? Right? Is this like a big failure, or was it the beginning of a new beginning? Right? For instance, right? I didn't get into film school. I could have told myself the story of, I'm a failed artist and now I'm writing about other people's art or something like that, right? And then I would be frustrated. Or I can tell myself the story that, I'm kind of happy that didn't get into film school because you always need to convince hundreds of people before you can start shooting, at least when you make these big films. And I don't like to do that. I like to be able to do my stuff on my own, and actually maybe it's better for me. So yeah, that's definitely a very important point, that stories define who we are, and we live through stories in a certain way, and our personal identity is strongly tied to stories. Even though, I mean, there's at least one person who questioned that strongly, who is Strawson, his name is, I think, Galen Strawson, and he said, well, there are two different types of people. There are episodics and there are narratives. So for a long time, people always spoke about, everybody having a narrative identity, and then he said, well, there's some people who are more episodic in their life. And of course, this can be tied to memory, right? Personally, I have bad memory. So a lot of events that happen to me don't exist for me. Therefore, they're not consciously part of my identity. But maybe they exist for my partner, for friends. So they are part of how they define our relationship, but I have forgotten. So, yeah.
Police, they make it part of your identity again.
Who?
Police.
Yeah, exactly. That could happen, yeah. Well, as Karl Kraus says, the scandal starts when police ends it. The scandal begins when police puts an end to it. Yeah. So that's, and of course also collective narrative identities, in the sense of, what are the stories the European Union has been telling about Crimea, and what's the stories that Putin has been telling Russia, and how do they lead to different worldviews? The story of Palestine that the Israelis tell versus the story of Palestine that the Palestinians tell. And there was even a project of a history book where they told both versions to children. And then they worked 10 years on it with experts, Israeli experts, Palestinian experts. Then the book came out, and it even had a third column for the child's version. And when it came out, Israel forbid it and Palestine forbid it. Because they can't accept that there are two stories. If you want people to die for your story, you need a unique story. They can't be like seeing another story, right? And so it's definitely a very, very important aspect of, why stories also matter to us. Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? Not, I'll show a bit of art and then we can talk a little more if you want.
This is the strongest narrative about sacrifice.
Yeah.
Actually, used by patriarchy also fighters for democracy and freedom.
Yeah, that's true.
In different sense.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, and also the idea of becoming part of a story that's unfolding and kind of influencing that big story, right? So whether it's, the triumph of communism or the triumph of freedom, and you will have been part of this story of the triumph of...
Dying on the front is better than hard accident.
Yeah, yes.
Explained to others.
Really. That makes total sense. I mean, when I watch these, there's something very interesting also about these prophetic narratives, of course, right? When at the time when ISIS was so powerful, and I had lived in Paris for 12 years, and then they did the Bataclan attack, so I kind of went into an ISIS rabbit hole, and I watched some propaganda videos, and there was one video that I found very striking where someone explained, well, in the Quran it is written that the Crusaders will take over, and there will only be a few just people who are fighting the Crusaders. That's us. So these prophetic narratives make space for you. You can then be in your holy book. That's like genius. It's a very interesting idea that's linked to that.
Projecting oneself into the future, the high dependency.
Yeah, and a future that has been written in the past, and yet, Yeah, so art, well, okay, good. One thing that Hans says in this book is as well that we've lost the ability to contemplate. I would like to have a few moments of contemplation. Of course, storytelling in art is not new. This is Lascaux, at least 15,000 years before Jesus Christ, and it seems to be a story.
It might be linked to ritual, but it doesn't necessarily exclude that it also tells some kind of story of a fight between this bison who's also hurt by a spear and has his intestines coming out, and this man who might have a bird's head and might be ityphalic, might have an erect penis. The archaeologists are very sure of this erect penis. I was never sure that this is really an erect penis, but okay. The archaeologists must know better. And so this is, of course, a very early kind of narrative. And then narrative accompanies us through, of course, antiquity. Here, this is also a very interesting narrative because it tells 90 lines in Odysseus in just one image. It's basically this guy starts eating the Odysseus people, and then they make him drunk after they tell him that his name is Nobody, and then they blind him, and then he calls for help, and the others come running and they say, "What happened to you?" And he said, "Nobody blinded me," and then they go back to sleep, and Odysseus escapes. So this is in an image, several moments of one story pulled together. I call this polychronic narrative. Yeah. And so there are different polychronic ways of narrating, and this is one way you synthesize different moments into one, but sometimes you also see the same character several times, which would be another way of polychronic narrative. Well, and this is William Hogarth telling a story, and let's try to prove Han wrong, that we're still able to contemplate what happened.
With a sword, which is on the top.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Maybe it wasn't her, but the guy who is in the window.
Okay, so this might be the person as well who had the sword. Yeah, and what is her role there? Okay, yeah. So she has two men. Yeah, that's true. So that's where Hogarth always puts his comments, and his irony is always in the details in the background. Yeah, very good point. There's also, we can't recognize it now here, but there's also another image, the Solomonic judgment of two women kind of tearing a child apart. Maybe you remember this. Yeah, true. So yeah, so she apparently was having an affair. Here's the bed. We see clothes on the floor. And this man who's dressed, so he wasn't involved, came in, and there was a fight. He was hurt with this saber, which also has blood, and he has blood as well. And maybe he's just falling. His saber just dropped, and now there are guards coming through the door. Who probably heard noise while the lover is trying to escape through the window. So this is, it's a very old narrative. It's invented by Hogarth. Hogarth was proud to not use narratives that pre-existed, biblical, mythological, but to tell modern moral tales, as he called them. Was extremely successful at his time, and people did what we did now, because he was mainly famous for doing prints, and then people bought these prints and looked at them, and it was maybe the Netflix of the time, if we want to say so, looking at these prints and trying to decrypt them. And this is one of a series of prints of an unhappy marriage called Mariage à la mode, which he brought out after he was able to make the English Parliament create the first copyright law, because people were constantly copying his prints, and so he militated for the Hogarth Act to protect them. Yeah, and this is one way to reconstruct the timeline in this image. So even though it shows one moment, there might be, several moments that are depicted. So they got rid of their clothes, the lover and the husband fought, the door opened, the husband came in. That's like one person, one candidate whom I showed that image to in a lab for cognitive research in art history, and that's a reconstruction. They fought, things are scattered around the room, then the husband was hurt by the lover dropped his sword. Now the wife is begging for forgiveness from
her husband. The husband is going to fall because of the harsh wound, and he just dropped his saber, while the lover is escaping through the window, and the guards are coming in, who heard the noise. So we have like one present moment, that's the 7, and then a lot of moments that are kind of actually present through traces. So this is a mix between telling the story through figures and telling it through traces. And we are all trace readers. Through history, we've learned to read traces, and therefore we can understand this image. I'll jump over this to move. I had a few more old images that we could analyze, but maybe I'll leave it to your future occupation at home. When you don't want to go on Instagram, you can look at a bit of Jean-Baptiste Greuze, who's another interesting storyteller of the time, and try to figure out what's happening in these images. To go to modern and contemporary art and look at the relationship to narrative here. The first thing that is interesting to see is that modern contemporary art wasn't very much into narrative at all for a long time. Actually, arguably was even narrative phobic. So people at the end of the 19th century said, before being a racehorse or a naked woman, a painting is colors on a surface. And this goes all the way then to Pollock, of course, who has no more narrative, no more figures in the image. And then possibly, because the narrative can't disappear, the making of the image becomes the story, right? So when Rosenberg calls it action painting, that's actually what he means, that the painting is a trace of the action. And the action is the action of the painter on the surface, but we got rid of, the conventional depicted narrative. And even people who are set to tell stories, like Eric Fischl, really don't tell any stories. They have truncated narratives, as James Elkins calls it. And Kuhn's pornographic picture, this is maybe the kind of Instagram image before Instagram in a certain way. We don't see any nipples, so Instagram wouldn't censor it, I suppose. As James Elkins says, the avoidance of narrative is one of the great dogmas or working assumptions of art production, criticism, and instruction today. There's a huge amount waiting to be written about how narrative is avoided and why it seems necessary to avoid it to artists. Something about pictorial modernism and postmodernism is anti-narrative, and something else about it is more simply non-narrative. Narrative isn't dead, but it's a dead issue. Even in a certain sense, Cindy Sherman takes out the narrative of the movie, but arguably here, as maybe opposed to these Jeff Koons images, we again start to have something which Han says is lacking, the enigma. We have the borders of enigmatic, we have the borders of not knowing. And this is something which you can find in art that narrates with openness, that embraces ambiguity, or that also uses traces, which is really also why I thought of this talk, hearing about your exhibition and your project and the question of traces in your work. So a kind of openness that comes through the trace. You show us the shells, but we don't know the stories. The stories will stay with you, right? Or they're not written, are they? Or are they somewhere?
There's a book in progress.
Oh, interesting. That would be also very interesting. Yeah, so here we have the trace somehow of this exchange, of this moment, but we don't see it. There's this element of openness. And Umberto Eco thinks that's constitutive of modernity, that ambiguity is a value in modernity, and it happens to be exactly what we might have lost with the traditional narrative, this ability to withstand openness, withstand ambiguity. This is someone I've just written about for the Albertina, so it's a bit present in my mind, but here there's a certain, even though the image is precise and is very clear, what is happening is not so clear. We don't really know who this character is, what the relationship is. maybe we understand that she's not just sleeping because just this weird way of nearly levitating or only touching the ground with her fingertips. We feel a sense of menace, this Gottfried Helnwein, and when we see the subtitle Nightmares of a Sleeping Child, that's one way to explain away the enigma. In a way, that's why I didn't show it initially, because it's a way to say, okay, it's weird, but it's just a nightmare kind of thing. Or in this image, something terrible apparently happened. It's called Bloody Boys, Blutige Knaben, also by Helnwein. And personally, I like this Helnwein even more than the other one, because he works with the trace of the hand, and suddenly this becomes part of the narrative. The trace of the making becomes part of the story that is being told, and the violence of this brush, of these strokes, of these pencil strokes, actually create the violence of the image, rather than just the content being what conveys the story. So here we have basically after Pollock, we have figurative storytelling after Pollock, where the trace of making becomes part of the story told, and of the ambience conveyed, of the Stimmung of the image, and so on. But it has this openness. We don't quite know what happened to these boys. Why are they praying? Are they asking for forgiveness? Are they asking for grace? What happened here? Helnwein is someone who was Austrian and was very shocked. He grew up after the war about a lot of Austrian war criminals being, freed by Austrian courts, and people were celebrating. And he said, that we know that they killed children for Dr. Grosch or for other people, and they are being freed. And so he shows all these terrible images as a way to put it in front of the eyes, a little bit in the mindset of Goya, who did the disasters of war, who said, war is horrible and I want to show it. Or of Georges Grosch, who also did the disasters of war. So that's one way, is this kind of openness, narrating with openness. But then there's also narrating with traces, and really a strong connection to narrative. Sibylle Kremer, German philosopher, says the semantics of the trace only unfolds in the logic of narration, in which the trace gets its narrative place, or its narrated place. And Carlo Ginzburg went even further in 1979 in an article called Sherlock Holmes, Morelli, Freud, where he connects these different figures. Morelli is founder of attributionism, so trying to figure out who made a painting based on their hand. And Morelli said we have to look at the places that people didn't make consciously. Because if I want to copy someone, I make sure that I make the face the same way, but maybe the fingernails or the ears, they become like signatures. An artist does so many of them that they become like a signature. That's where we find in the unconscious, now we could say with Freud, in the unconscious of the image. But Morelli wrote these texts before Freud, and Freud apparently read them, and the argument goes that it might have influenced Freud's theory, that it's actually in what we do unconsciously that the reality is revealed. And then Walter Benjamin again, who said, the trace is the appearance of a closeness sofern sie sein mag, it has to be, sie sein mag, as far as it might be, as what left the trace might be. The aura is the appearance of a distance, independently of how close is what causes her. And I wanted to end with a few artworks, and then in the exhibition we see more artworks that I find have this dimension that, that operate with the trace. This is a work by Benjamin Hogarth called Victoire sur le Soleil, and it looks like from afar it might even look like a kind of modernist painting, and it's a neo-modernist, neo-constructivist painting more precisely, on a wall of an area in Nizza, where mostly immigrants live, and you can see these traces on the wall of a car that burned, or something that burned, apparently. Now there are many ways in which we could make sense of this trace-based narrative. It could be about the ideal of transforming people through art, maybe about artful decoration of a poor neighborhood and how it doesn't change the social reality, or about even the vision of constructivism to change our way of seeing through art, through abstract art, and the potential failure in a certain sense of this. And at the same time, it's just a photograph of a wall in Nizza where a car burned, or maybe a motorcycle. This is a work that connects to my last talk here that I showed last year when I came by Hannah Uzui. Showed it in a bit of different context. But it's very small like this. It looks big now, but it's much smaller. And it's basically burned. There's some traces in the background, and then the plexiglass burned, and the frame burned, and it smells burned. And when you hang it on the wall, which we did on an exhibition, it leaves traces on the wall because of the burned frame. And it's called Black Rain, and there are many ways, many things we could associate with it, but she made it in 2015 around the time of Fukushima, and it's a work that was in an exhibition that was around Hiroshima and then also Fukushima. And once you know it, it can become a kind of image of the total destruction. The possibility of showing is even destroyed. Right? It's a disaster that's so great that the support of where I could show the disaster is burned. The frame, the image burns away as well. And so it gives us also a trace-like, maybe auratic presence of the events it refers to. And one last example is by Anneliese Schrenk. It's called Hülle, which means, can you help me again? Hülle.
Cover, but
yeah, something like cover or enclosure, something that you have around a body. And it's the skin of an animal that has suffered from a skin disease, a cow, and can't be used for leather production. And so it's discarded by leather production. But in a way, this tells us about, for me, the similarity between this animal and ourselves. And here I chose to hang it with this butcher's hanger. For me, whenever I saw this, I showed it in an exhibition that was called Show Me Your Wound, or co-curated in Vienna at the Dom Museum. I had like this feeling on my skin, and suddenly this cow skin felt, very similar to my skin. But it was only the imperfect cow skin. When you see a perfect leather, you never have this feeling that this is actually the skin of an animal. But here with these herds, you have that feeling. So it's like our wounds connect us to other animals, our vulnerability and the lack of perfection. And it tells, in a certain way, part of the story of the life of this cow. It also has traces of the barbed wire, where you can also see some when you look further and so on, through this trace. And this is another kind of open artwork by Nelson Jalil Sardiñas, Algo Vivo Dentro de Algo Muerto, and I was immediately enchanted by this work because of its simplicity and because it, conveys so many possible associations. It's also unclear what it is about, but we can probably feel that it has to do with, organic life and the attempt to free yourself and being held back. And depending on who we are, we might think more of what holds us back or of the freedom we still find, this bread that still spreads out, and still kind of broke through the fence and kind of incorporated the fence. So it's nearly a way to say, okay, we have the limitations, we have things that disturb us, but let's try to go through as much as we can through them. Yeah, so these are some directions in which I do think that perhaps
contemporary art can be a space for us to keep learning the openness towards different interpretations of reality, which is starting to go amiss, and to accept the openness of interpretation of events, not to have to immediately frame it as either black or white, not to only believe in one possible story. It's a relatively protected space. It's not about, immigration. It's not a space where we need to talk about how many immigrants we let in, how we relate to climate change. And therefore it maybe can be a space where we can kind of try to train ourselves again, or also train others when we are artists and curators and exhibition makers, to the multiplicity of narratives, and to accepting that multiple narratives are compatible with the same artifact. And when you know that he's Cuban, Nelson Sardinia's another kind of narrative comes in, and I showed this to two Cubans working at the airport as a test in Berlin, in a watch store, and I was like, you're Cuban, I have an artwork by a Cuban, what do you think this is? And they said, this is our island. It's a prison island. This is our prison island. And so for Cubans, there's yet another very precise interpretation that's associated with this image. Yes, so I hope and think that, artists can resist the attempt to go the Instagram way, to make the images that immediately are consumable in 3 seconds, and to have this, to leave this space for openness, not to try to make necessarily artworks that are narratogenic or that strike, like this Maurizio Cattelan, that convey a clear message, like this artist working for an advertisement campaign and putting this fearless girl in front of the raging bull of Wall Street. Not even a bad artwork in a way. Makes a point, but also to keep working in this more open way, consciously narrating with traces. I think traces have this potential of, creating a space for different interpretations, for openness, for aura, for connection to the actual thing, like your shells. And I hope we can still, after the talk, go together and look at it together and talk about it together. Well, this is for me, the end of what I wanted to tell you today. I also wanted to leave some space for conversation, so I'll stop here. And maybe we can share some stories.
Thank you.